So I've had quite a bunch of that. People saying they're going to necklace me when I come back and they're going to wait for me at the airport. I think if Afrikaners, for example, go to America in high numbers, we will become Americans eventually. It might not be first generation, probably second generation. If you think voting is the solution, you're in trouble.
Thank you, Ernst. You go to Tucker, you go to Ben Shapiro, and now you come to the best one yet. So
Yes, I'm happy to speak with you.
thank you so much. Tell me, how was your trip to America? Very successful. How good was it?
Oh, it was very good. It was about 2 weeks, but it felt like 2 months because we had, I don't know how many meetings I had. I think I counted about 12 and 5 podcasts in 2 weeks, and I don't know how many states I had to travel to. So it was struck in and out, but it was very good. I think it was good in terms of the meetings, especially now with all the stuff happening in America with Trump's executive order, and there's a lot of interest in Washington. So that was good. The podcasts were very good, and the meetings were very good. And then we had this conference. So there was a team from Urania there as well. And so we sort of met each other in Washington. And there was a joint conference in New York hosted by the New York Young Republicans Club, which was also very good. It's really a great group, the Young Republicans. And so that was, I think, the last day where I spoke and Joost from Urania also spoke. And that was really good. It was like it was at their clubhouse. And it was so full. Eventually it was sold out. You have to buy, I think, $10 to attend, and it was sold out, and then they decided, let's just open it for another 50 or 100 or I don't know. And it was so squashed and cramped, but which was a good thing. It's a good sort of vibe for a political meeting, like everyone standing with a drink in their hand, and then you speak, and it's not like a conference room with a stage. It's just sort of standing between people with a drink in your hand, making a speech. So that was really good.
Yeah, we need some of those clubs here. Something I would advocate. So you didn't go there on a fact-finding mission for refugee status?
No, a lot of people thought that actually. And I spoke with friends this week. Someone said to me, well, I actually thought you moved to America. So are you visiting, or how's the process? And so even people close to me started thinking that I'm in the process of moving. But no.
So you're not someone who is looking for refugee status in the US? Not at all?
I always joke and say, if everyone leaves, I'll close the door. I'll be the last one to close the door. I have no intention of leaving.
So, tell us about that, because, I know the history of Afrikaners. I'm not Khilumia or like a real historian in this regard, but Afrikaners are Africans, right? Yeah. It's like the white tribe of Africa, the only white tribe of Africa. Can Afrikaners actually be Afrikaners in other countries? In the real sense.
Yeah. That's a very good question. And I spoke with I have a friend who's a Hungarian. He's a researcher in Hungary on typography and mapping, especially of minorities. And he has this saying, I've heard him say this more than once, and it sort of stuck with me. He said, when you take a culture off the land, you lose the culture. And so the argument is that the question is, can a cultural community leave their home or their homeland and go to another country and remain who they are? And I'm not so sure that it's possible. And there might be some examples. We can talk about the Jews as an example and so forth. But I think if Afrikaners, for example, go to America in high numbers, we will become Americans eventually. It might not be first generation, probably second generation. And it makes sense to become an American if you live in America.
Of course.
And
is it, sorry to interrupt, but is that executive order, like, do you find it threatening? As an Afrikaner?
It could be threatening. I think it's good. It's a good executive order, and it's good for us that the Trump administration, and not just the Trump administration, the people all over the world are increasingly taking note of what's happening in South Africa. That is good. And there are people who want to leave, who want to go. And if they want to go and it can be easier for them to go, that's fine. We just hope that such people remain in contact, that they don't just assimilate where they are and lose all contact with their own people or their own families and so forth. So I know a lot of people who have left South Africa who are still contributing in some way. Yeah. That's good. So they can be ambassadors for our cause where they live. But if the only thing the Trump administration does, or any administration or any group outside, is to encourage people to leave South Africa and nothing else, then it's more bad than good, because we need to find solutions here. And I think the Trump administration, as an example, can help pressure the South African government away from bad policies, more toward a good policy environment and so forth. And so in that sense, it's good.
It's good in that sense. Do you think democracy has been good for Afrikaners since 1994?
Well, that's probably a loaded question because the one part of it is, what is democracy? And so one of the arguments we hear is that not just Afrikaners, but white people in South Africa have actually gotten richer after 1994.
Which is true, though.
Yeah, it was
correct.
After the BEE laws, and that's sort of the maybe the invisible hand, as Adam Smith calls it, working in a unique way where especially the Afrikaners, and I actually didn't think about this until Russell Lamberti, who you both know, mentioned this somewhere, and it was really sort of an eye-opener that historically, before 1994, the Afrikaner people were not really associated with entrepreneurship. The Afrikaners were very much involved with politics or the army or cultural organizations and so forth, or they worked for the government. And we were forced out by the new political dispensation. And so one of the unintended consequences of something like BEE and affirmative action is it forced us to become entrepreneurs.
Correct.
And so we started our own businesses. And today, the comment was that Afrikaners are sort of more associated with entrepreneurship than many, in a certain sense, than white English South Africans. And you have these big Afrikaner companies and so forth. So in that sense, it has been good. But that's only a consequence of you might call oppression, or a consequence of being marginalized and trying to find an alternative solution. The way in which it was bad is, I think we, and I can say we, even though I was very small, I was kindergarten, the Afrikaners, or at least those who were in power, were very naive about the new South Africa and what it could look like. And I actually just wrote a piece about that for the Pioneer Initiative. One of the arguments back in 1994, or in the run-up to 1994, was people were concerned about the direction South Africa could go under the ANC. And people were saying, remember, this is a communist movement. Yeah. And then the argument by the National Party, people like Rolf Meyer and so forth, said, but remember that Nelson Mandela is the president, and he's going to be the president of the new South Africa, as if he's immortal. And he was president for 5 years, and he's not president anymore. Mbeki took over, and then Ntlante and Zuma and so forth. So it's very naive to base a political system, or to argue that a political system is sustainable based on the personality of the person who's currently leading the party.
Correct. But there's always like a sort of end of history moment.
Yeah.
Like the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union fell. The ANC in the 90s has no choice but to become sort of liberals and constitutionalists and things like that. I remember the arguments quite well, and I was quite a big believer in that sort of thing in my youth, and especially at university. They really hammered this in, like, human beings are just like nails to be hammered. Like, hammer them with liberalism, hammer them with, whatever, economics, and they'll come out as productive members of societies. But there's something much deeper than that.
Yeah.
And it also applied to Afrikaners. Like, Afrikaners came from rural livestock for the most part, lots of agriculture, trauma through the Anglo-Boer War. The National Party tried to do some things, but after that, it was like, okay, well, now we all can be sort of like just liberals, miraculously, because the political situation changes. But that's not how life works. Yeah. In reality, there are some nascent features of people that you can't just hammer out.
Yeah. There's an interesting book about that, just sort of as a run-up to answering your question. It's called Apartheid, Britain's Bastard Child. But the story, the book is largely about how the apartheid system was a result of how the Afrikaner people were treated by the British, which created, so it's not Oppression Olympics, but the Afrikaner people have had also quite a tragic history, and which developed a sort of sense of a heightened resolve, or sense of a resolve that we need to take drastic steps in order to survive.
Yeah.
And so this book was, I think it was written by a psychologist who sort of from a psychological perspective tried to understand the reasoning of the Afrikaners who thought that this would be a solution. But I mention this because people differ. We don't only have experience as individuals. We have collective experiences as well. We have experiences as a community.
Of course.
And one way, it's a controversial thing today, but something that really struck me from one of G.K. Chesterton's works was he wrote about this modern idea that we are all just individuals. And what I like about Chesterton is he writes, and then it's as if he's diverted, as if something sort of takes away his attention, and then he tells this story. In one of his books, he says, he writes, and then he says, a little girl just walked past my window, and then he starts writing about this girl. But he then says, so everyone's talking about modernism and how we are all just individuals. But across from me, in this London tea shop where I'm sitting now, there's a Chinese guy, and I honestly feel that I have more in common with Herodotus than I do with this person.
Right.
And then he said, I think I understand how Isaiah and I think he said David or some of these ancient, biblical figures, I think I sort of understand the way they felt in a way that this person who's sitting across from me doesn't understand, in the same way that he understands how Liang Zhang felt, how these Chinese emperors, what their frame of reference was in a way that I don't understand.
Sure.
And so it's the same, that's sort of on a macro civilizational scale, but it's also on a cultural level that it's not just natural or normal, but it's probably a good thing, because if I look at the Battle of Blood River and the Day of the Vow, and I have a certain narrative of that and a certain emotion about that, and I speak with a friend who's a Zulu, and that person has a different narrative. That's just how things are.
It makes perfect sense to have a different narrative about the same set of facts.
Yes, exactly.
Like I can say the Holocaust was terrible in these ways, but if you speak to a Jewish friend, it's like, it's much more than just terrible in these ways. It's like a detrimental end of life movement for their community.
Yeah.
So I think that's perfectly valid to say that. So now that we know you're not applying for refugee status, and we know for a fact that you're a father.
Yes.
I really want this conversation to really deal with, I'm a father, you're a father. I want my family to stay here in this area. It's called South Africa now, and maybe called something else later. If you win, it's going to be called something else entirely. We'll get to that. But what can we do? Like, I have a great life here. I really like this country. I'm sure you have a far deeper connection to this country than I do. Are you worried our children won't?
I am worried that people are leaving. I think many more have left than we would have hoped, just over the decades.
Yeah.
I don't think, and I should add, I hope that this executive order by the Trump administration wouldn't lead to like a massive flood of people leaving the country. But I certainly want to stay here. And I think that it's also important to know that every country has problems, and we should fight against the problems in our countries where we live. And so it's good for an American person to be outspoken against wokeness or whatever, the same way we should be outspoken against problems where we live. But we must not be naive to think that it's horrible in South Africa and the grass is green everywhere else. I can go to Australia and then I'll have a wonderful life there, or New Zealand or the Netherlands. And we increasingly see people who have left South Africa decades ago or years ago, either coming back or saying this, or complaining about the circumstances where they are, saying, I live in Australia, but it's horrible where we are now. It's a different set of problems. So in Australia, for example, if you're a Christian and you go to church on Sundays, or you want your child to go to a school with a Christian ethos, it's quite difficult. I didn't know that Australia was as secular as it is. And I've heard many stories of Christians, people leaving South Africa who are Christians, who felt very marginalized or isolated. Yeah. And it's not so much of a problem in South Africa. So we have problems, but other countries have problems.
Yeah, or I think it's in Scotland, it's like you pray or act like you pray within like 200 meters of an abortion clinic. Like that's hate speech.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yes.
Like even if you don't pray out loud, if you just stand in the corner. Yeah. Tucker Carlson spoke about it to Piers Morgan, because they would argue about the Second World War and what,
England is
the fact that England won. And you're like, what did you win? You can't even pray in public.
Yes.
Well, without going to jail. We can.
Yeah.
In this country. So, I mean, there's trade-offs everywhere.
Yeah.
But
just the other day, someone was praying for me in public.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was standing next to the street and someone said, listen, can I pray for you, PK? And I thought it was great. And it's not a problem, but it's weird to think that there are countries where you cannot do that.
Yeah. If you go to Saudi Arabia, I fully understand if they don't allow that.
Yeah.
Right. But England, the heart of
Yeah, England especially.
Some elements.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Western civilization. But so what can we do in this country for our children? I keep going back to this because I actually don't know. Voting harder is not working.
Yeah.
To me, every election is almost like a racial census based on what we spoke before about. Yep. We're different people, we have different ideas, we have different perspectives on what is happening in the world. And to cobble everything together under like a constitution, like it's bullshit. We can walk you around, you can tell, like it's just not working out. So if I want my children to live here, good, healthy, productive, safe lives, and you want that for your children too, do you have any ideas on how we can do that in a way that's not this macro issue or a national level issue, but like...
Yeah, so I think the answer lies probably on two levels, on a macro level and a micro level. And I think we must be very cautious of looking for silver bullets or, there's just this one thing. We just need to do this one tweak and then problem solved. And I see that a lot. Someone goes out, it could be me, it could be someone else goes out and does a certain thing, and which is a good thing. And then some people would respond and say, but how will this help us? And it's a valid question. We should always ask that question. But if the assumption behind that question is we need to find this one thing that we can do, we're not going to find it.
Vote the government out. And then?
Yes, that's a good example. That's probably the best example. As people they only think that voting, if you think voting is the solution, you're in trouble. Because I made a speech in Washington last year, and I actually wondered if I should say this or not. And I used the term vote mind virus. I say you guys are concerned about the woke mind virus, but you should also be concerned about the vote mind virus. And the vote mind virus is when you think your problems will be solved by voting it out, voting your problems away, or voting solutions in. It doesn't work that way. So I think to get to your question, I think on a macro level, what needs to happen is there needs to be some form of a dispensational change, because where things are headed is not sustainable. It's with a new president is not going to fix things. Another party in power is not going to fix things. There needs to be a macro political solution. And on a micro level, I think it boils down to culture. And culture can be sort of a macro thing, but it can also be a micro thing, because a particular culture within a family. Teaching our children about responsibilities as opposed to human rights. So my son he's in grade 7 now. He's a what do you call it, a prefect or a member of the student board at his primary school, and he actually had to make a speech on Human Rights Day. And I was actually proud of him. He said to me he wanted me to help him with his speech, but he said to me he wants to make a speech about responsibilities. And so we have Human Rights Day, but we don't have Responsibilities Day. And so his speech was about, it was like a 2-minute speech, but he said that, human rights is important and we need to respect each other, the right to free speech. But what do these rights help if it's not coupled with responsibility? And I think in South Africa especially, this thing of just waiting for the government to fix your problems or demanding that your rights be protected it can be very toxic. And the problem is not rights in itself. The problem is when rights become detached from the idea that you have to contribute and you have to develop yourself. You have to, and so another example is, as I think most parents do, have this constant battle in my house with screen time. So we call it, that was to me the best thing about COVID and the lockdown is the term lockdown. People know what it means. And so we have the word screen lockdown in my house.
Right.
And if everyone's on cell phones, then I would say we have screen lockdown and everyone needs to put down their cell phones and switch off the Xbox. Or I would say in 20 minutes, we're going to have screen lockdown. And my son said to me the other day, and I must just remember that most of his general knowledge he gets from YouTube.
Correct.
And I want to encourage them to read as they do. But so the point is that times are changing, and we need to be able to adapt to that. But I think there are still some eternal truths, which includes knowing who you are, knowing where you come from, living in gratitude as opposed to living in entitlement. And I think that type of thing starts at home.
So I fully agree with you. So when you spoke about the micro level, I think we will agree on this. It might be better at macro level to have just a frozen government. Like I want emotional no confidence, like every 2 weeks. I want a new president every 6 months. I want parliament to agree on absolutely nothing. I think on the macro level, if the dispensation cannot dispense, so to speak, it gives us far more time to actually work on this sort of cultural issues we wish to work on, especially with our children. But there are things we can't control as a family, right? Safety, for example, or I've been looking to homeschooling, and the more I read about it, the more I think I'm just not fit for it, but maybe I can hire someone who is fit for it. Like, there's a lot of things that society values that are not inherently valuable to us as fathers. But there's also a thing where if the school is woke, do you take your children out completely, or do you just say, this is it, look how terrible it is, now you know what we're fighting against? Like, what's that sort of immunization idea that we can do that strengthens us but doesn't devalue what we're trying to do?
That's a very good question, and it's also a debate that I've been involved with for some time personally, and among, so you could say, more conservative Afrikaner circles. This thing about schools is a very heated debate, because we have, for example, the BSCVO, die Beweging vir Christelike Volks eie Onderwys. So it's a private school system that is Christian and Afrikaner oriented. And it's fairly small, but it's very conservative, and they have Bible classes and so forth. I didn't go to such a school, but I have many friends who went to those schools. And I have friends whose children, some of my best friends' children are in CFU school, as we call it. I went to a government school, and my children are in a government school. Now, that's not because I don't want them to be in a private school. It's not because I have a problem with the BSCFU. I actually think it's a very good initiative. And then I would consider putting my children in there's some practical reasons why it's not the case. But my approach is somewhat, you could say, unconventional, and I'm not so sure if people should take my advice on this. But my approach is I think it's good, and I know my friends in the CFU school would take an issue with this, but I think it's good for a child to learn the most important things that they need to learn from their parents. They should learn it at home, of course. And it's also good for a child at a certain point in their life to become exposed to the dangers of the world. And in this case, my children are taught stuff in history class and so forth that I'm uncomfortable with. But I can sit down with them and discuss it with them. And now I know most people don't do that. But I think my straightforward answer would be, rather, if you can put your children in a private school that is aligned with your religion, with your culture, with your values, do that. If you don't do that, then the responsibility on you to be much more, to be very involved with your children in terms of what they think and what they believe is very important.
Yeah, so I found a hack for schooling. So my daughter goes to a private school, which is ostensibly Christian, but it's 30% Muslim.
Interesting.
And it's the Muslims who are far more community orientated than English speakers, who will refuse to have anything subversive happen at school. So they're far more militant about it.
I mean, anti-woke.
Yes, anti all that sort of stuff. And now if you go to school, as I said, about 30% Muslim, the rest is mixed, black and white. But there's a very nice balance between the sort of Christian ethos and the Muslim ethos that sort of fits in very well. And the school is like absolutely perfect. And like, I'm really happy with it. So if people are worried about schooling, like, go to a place that's like, there's a minority of Muslims, but they can be the dominant minority. It works very well. And my suburb is becoming the same. So my suburb in Joburg is becoming more Muslim, and I love that. They got money, they got guns, we agree on 80% of things, very family orientated, very capitalist. So I find myself very comfortable in the sort of so-called diversity, but diversity hides the fact that we are aligned on so many things.
So I think firstly, on a religious level, I don't see Christianity and Islam, finding each other. No. But what was interesting to me, to speak to your point, was last year with the Olympic Games and that famous opening ceremony in Paris.
to my eternal shame.
Yeah.
I was born in Paris.
Your people.
Yeah,
yes.
my people.
What was striking to me was that it would be very dramatic to say that it was the end of wokeness, but that caused an uproar in a lot of non-Christian, non-Western circles as well.
Yes.
A lot of people in China and Asia, other Asian countries, and in the Middle East, Muslims, and so forth. People who said, and Africa is largely Christian, but people who said, listen, it's going too far. And I think people have started to realize that what's happening in the world, what's happening in the Western world, has gotten past the point where it's an assault on the West and an assault on Christianity. It has become an assault on religion, and it has become an assault on the notion of civilization, the notion of culture.
Yeah. And not just Western civilization, like civilization in general.
Yes, exactly. And of course they have these double standards. You know, this joke, some guy in London put up posters saying Islam is right about women, just to see how people on the left would respond. Do they agree with Islam or do they not? And so we have this bizarre double standards in woke ideology, but the essence thereof is if they succeed in destroying Western civilization, it will just go on to the next. It's because it's anti-civilization.
Correct.
And I think you're right in that sense that Muslim people see this as well, and they also take a firm stance against.
And especially here in South Africa, it's a very particular group of people that you don't really find elsewhere. But I mean, what they've done since 1994 has been like breathtakingly brilliant. Like in terms of income levels, education levels, the amount of firearms per capita. I mean, the fact that the KZN riots of July 2021 happened in KZN was like sort of the downfall of those riots. If it happened in the Western Cape, I think it would have been far worse. But the Muslims in the KZN were like well armed, got money, have community, etc., etc. They don't have to be our allies. But I think this idea of cross-cultural interaction like this is something that you would agree with.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to your point on Cape Town, I struggle to imagine how the people jogging on the promenade would respond to the type of riots. With respect to the people, I went for a jog on the promenade once.
No.
The stereotypical thing, there's pictures of Cyril Ramaphosa when he became president, walking on the promenade, and everyone ran towards him for selfies. I don't know how a lot of people in Cape Town would respond to that. But you're right, and to see how the Indian or Muslim community in KZN responded was quite remarkable. And so I think to go to your point is, if we're looking for a macro solution, and I just made a video about this yesterday, that we obviously, I'm an Afrikaner and I want the Afrikaner people to be free, but a solution for that cannot be a solution for the one at the expense of the other. And the principle, if the principle is self-governance and the principle is recognition of diversity as it ought to be recognized, then communities like that should have freedom as well. Even if from a religious perspective, I don't agree with them, but I want for them what I want for my community. I don't want more for my community than I want for their community. And I think that is what South Africa misses. And if we just say and believe that we just, as John Locke said, an aggregate of men or just a number of people and we make up, the state, then you miss that. You miss the fact that there are different communities with not just different religions and different cultures, but different civilizations living within South Africa.
We made a video about Afrikaners and Zulus an alliance. They can not save South Africa, but an alliance that can work very well between the two cultures, because you share quite a lot of values together. But we should actually put in the Indian community into that as well. Just a note. Just a note. What do I want to say? Yes, this idea of communities having sort of equal autonomy, especially in South Africa, we've got 12 distinct communities, or 12 language groups at the very least, 11. There's also this idea about the end of the open society, which we spoke about before, privately. This idea that post-World War II, people didn't want that to be, they wanted to find out what caused such gross atrocities on that level. And the solution seems to be like a lot of these countries who participated, especially the Germans, the Italians, were these closed societies that focus a lot on sort of ethnic loyalty, hegemonic religions. So the solution to not having another World War III is to sort of dilute those things from people and create what's called the open society based on scientific inquiry, open rational dialogue, etc., 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 which sort of makes sense. The argument does make sense, and at the time, after the destruction of the West, it does make sense that that would be a solution. There has been an argument made more recently that time frame for the open societies is practically over with Trump 2.0. And we don't know how it's going to play out, but I think this idea of independent cultures within a geographic zone or independent countries within globalism is something that's going to be much more, we're going to see it much more in the future as well. Do you feel like there's a change, especially in South Africa, perhaps, that it's the end of the liberal society idea of the nation state of South Africa, but now we're going to be like, okay, well, like the Indians and we like each other, or the Zulus, we like each other, and the Afrikaners and we like each other. We can all like intermingle and talk and trade and whatever the case may be, but do you feel like we're going back to that
and appreciate
in this country?
An appreciation for your culture doesn't need to or shouldn't mean that you have disrespect for other cultures, because appreciation for your culture should by definition mean that you appreciate the notion of culture, which means that you appreciate cultures that aren't yours. And Viktor Orban, I heard him talk about this once on Hungary. He said he went to the Middle East recently and he mentioned some cities, or some, it might have been North Africa. And he said he went to these Muslim cities and he thought it was incredibly beautiful. And he went to some of the mosques and he saw some of the art and he was really blown away by the beauty of it. And then he said, it's very beautiful, but there where it is.
Yeah.
So, and what he was trying to say with it, it's different from my culture and it's different from my religion. And I want to appreciate it. And appreciation implies that what I have ought to be respected and what they have ought to be respected. And I do think, I think there's definitely a shift happening in South Africa and in the world, like you mentioned. And you mentioned Ben Shapiro. It was actually, I met him and I was on his show and we had a quick talk afterwards. And I run the risk of putting words into his mouth, but we spoke about this idea of the American dream. That was after the interview. And he made an interesting remark. And he spoke about what is the American dream, and to a large extent the American dream has been, I want a bigger house than my parents, or
Sure.
I want a more expensive car than my parents had, or I want to go to New York and become a lawyer or something. I come from Kansas and I want to be a New York attorney or something. And J.D. Vance has spoken about the American dream a lot recently, and he defines it differently. He says the American dream is being buried in the same graveyard as your grandparents were buried. And it's about contributing to your community and growing up, becoming successful, and then making a difference where you grew up and things like that. So the way, I don't want to say the American dream is changing, but the way people are starting to explain what the American dream is less in materialistic terms now and more in cultural terms.
It's like Tucker Carlson was on Ben Shapiro like 3-4 years ago, and this is where he changed my idea. Because Ben was talking about the free market and you can do whatever you want. And then Tucker's like, leave your hometown where your parents are buried to increase shareholder value in New York. Yeah. What a stupid idea. I'm like, actually, that is a stupid idea. Yeah. I was quite libertarian at the time. Of course, just go where it makes sense and make cash and make money and live your best life. It's like, but no, why are you leaving the graves of your ancestors behind for someone else to look after, to increase shareholder value at a law firm where you're going to be an associate and work 100 hours a week or a month or whatever the case might be. It's Tucker Carlson who came out with this idea, economic progress is not a dream. Yeah. It could be slavery in other ways, but your duty is to where you come from. Like your duty is towards those who lived before you. And to leave them like that.
And affluence could be a source of demise.
Yeah, correct. But it's not a dream to leave behind people who made you.
Yeah.
Not in the physical sense, but like in the spiritual sense as well, the metaphysical sense. And I think a lot of people grapple with that in this country as well. So I'm not from here. I'll born in Europe, but I came here at the age of 3. So I've got no people buried here, no family members buried here, thankfully. But I assume as an Afrikaner, you know exactly where your grandparents are buried or your ancestors. I mean, it's going to be difficult to say,
Yep.
yeah, I'm going to leave this to go to New York to run the Afrikaner Foundation and get $1 million a year. Like, I understand the $1 million, but where's the duty?
What do you lose in the process?
Yeah.
So in my family, just on the roots side, the first roots of whom I descend, who came to South Africa, was Nicolaas Roets. He came from Germany, and he was 8 years older than George Washington. And he came round about, we don't know the exact year, but it was about the time when Washington was a teenager. So then if you can trace your lineage and your history back that far, then there's some form of an attachment also. And obviously the metaphor of being buried next to your grandfather, it's a metaphor, but the underlying point is to, as you mentioned, there's a metaphysical element, is contributing to the people who made you, is a way of expressing your gratitude for where you come from, helping your parents, helping your community. And it's not just the family. The family, of course, is the core, but it's also the institutions that made you, contributing to the school you went to in some way. And it's also not just financial contribution, it's being involved in some way. And just on a practical level, there's been quite a lot of studies about the importance of community involvement in schools, how a school in which the community is more involved tends to be a better school, of course, for obvious reasons. And it's great to see, that's one of the reasons why the Afrikaans schools are doing so well in South Africa, is if you go to these schools, like any of these schools, if you go in the afternoon, you'll see children doing sports, and oftentimes there's more parents than children there. And so the parents are very involved with these schools. And this thing with the government's trying to do with the Bella Act to take away the power of the parents, essentially. There's no way that's going to fix a school. It's only going to make a school worse.
Yeah. No, it really is. So I don't think we actually answered the question, the fundamental question about how can we ensure that our children live happy, prosperous lives here. But I don't think we need to have an answer in a way that we can just set the foundation in some ways. Now, while they're young.
I think there is an element of the importance of being economically successful. That's definitely important. Yes. But I think if there is an answer, again, it's not a silver bullet, or there isn't a silver bullet. It's a combination of things. But I don't necessarily have the answer, but at least the way I understand it is we need to, at home, teach our children about things that give us meaning, and the difference between things that seem to give us meaning, like a high salary and things like that, but in the long run has the potential to take away the meaning that we have. And Professor Dani Goossens from academia often talks about the importance of gratitude. And essentially, and the way we think about reality, and if we think about reality, the things around us, our families, our children, what we see, what we perceive as a gift, as something that we have inherited that we don't deserve, then by definition you have to be grateful for it, and you live in gratitude. So it's about how we think of reality. It's a bit philosophical, but I think it's very important. How do we think about our children, about our parents, about what we have? If we think about it as something that we don't deserve, but we have it as a result of things that people who were here before us did, then you have a much more proclivity to live in gratefulness, in gratitude. If you think of it as a burden, as something that isn't a gift, then you don't have gratitude. You don't live in gratitude, and you are much more inclined to destructive behavior. And so I think one of the most important things is to teach our children about gratitude, to teach them to be grateful. And that doesn't mean don't change the world. I think telling our kids to go and change the world is
shocking idea.
It's bad advice. Yeah. Sometimes it's good advice, but to change the world just for the sake of changing it is not a good thing. No. Or this thing of you can be anything you want to is also not true, because each of us have a unique set of talents and skills. And so you can't do anything. I cannot be a pilot. I cannot be an accountant. And if I try to become one, I might succeed, but I wouldn't be as good an accountant or in the finance world as I am in what I do now, because I have a particular personality and a skill set that counts for everyone. And that's good that we have different skills, and we, as a collective, if we each find our place where we contribute in terms of our own skills, we're all better off.
Yeah.
And so the point that I'm trying to make is we should teach our children not just to change the world, but also to preserve it. That there are certain things in the world that shouldn't change and that we should fight to protect it. And there are some bad things that should change and we should fight to change it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I actually sort of fully agree with you in that regard. So this pioneer initiative, so you left AfriForum, then you left Solidarity, which are the two biggest Afrikaner institutions, I would say, in the country. You've done extremely well, very important work, very influential, very powerful. And you left now to do this, the Pioneer Initiative, I think you're calling it. What are you going to achieve through this? Or what do you hope to achieve through this, rather? What is it?
So firstly, my move from AfriForum to Solidarity was about 2 years ago. So AfriForum is a member of the Solidarity movement. Yeah. Technically, I didn't move to Solidarity. I moved to the Solidarity movement, which is a smaller office. Solidarity is the workers' part. It used to be the trade union, but I don't think it's correct to call it a trade union anymore. It's not in the traditional sense of the word. It's more a movement aimed at workers' rights and training and so forth. The labor market, you could say. And then the movement is sort of when these organizations come together as a collective. And then I was involved there as head of policy. And I, about a month ago, started this Pioneer Initiative. And the point is that I think we're at a point in time now where I'm still a member of those organizations, of AfriForum and Solidarity and the other institutions in the Solidarity movement. And I'm still involved. But what makes this different, that what I'm doing now at least, is it's more macro-politically focused. So AfriForum has a very strong, AfriForum does a lot of things, but I think the core of it is that it has a very strong emphasis on community organizing and on civil rights. And I'm not very much in the game of community organizing or civil rights, like going to court on expropriation without compensation and that type of things. My focus now in this Pioneer Initiative, which by the way is still sort of a preliminary thing, even the name will probably change as time progresses, but my focus now predominantly is the broad direction things are headed. And so there's a strong think tank element. In other words, where are we headed? Where could we head in the bad sense? In other words, how could things get worse? So scenario planning. Mm-hmm. And what can we do to prevent this worse things from happening? And how could things be better? And what can we do to achieve that? So it's a strong, you could say it's a combination of a think tank with a pressure group.
Okay, because that's sort of the reason why I wanted to talk about sort of fatherhood and children, because I think through the Pioneer Initiative, it's even also a sort of end of the open society idea.
Yes.
Like you've taken that on board and you're like, South Africa could maybe not be a nation in 50 years or maybe even less. Maybe South Africa is an economic zone hobbled together in 1910 that maybe it shouldn't have been an economic zone. What do you wish to achieve though? Like what is the actual initiative in the Pioneer Initiative? Like what is it?
So firstly, I think part of the question is, was South Africa ever a nation? Or is it so if you think North Africa, it's a collection of nations and countries. East Africa is a collection of countries. West Africa is a collection of countries. South Africa is one country. And that is inhabited by, I would say, a variety of nations who don't govern themselves. And so if we say we need more self-governance, that could take different forms. And I think we must be cautious to try to think too far ahead, because things could go in different directions. We should think far ahead, but we should consider that there could be different outcomes and things could get better in different ways. And we need to look at all these different options and perhaps pursue all of them, or see which of them are more realistic and which are less realistic. So one better outcome could be South Africa becomes a federation, like the United States, where the provinces operate more like states as opposed to provinces with their own governors and so forth. That would already be better because the government would be closer to the people. And it could still be one country with different states. So that's one option. Another option is some form of cultural autonomy, that even though South Africa is still South Africa, the communities within South Africa have more autonomy over their own affairs, even though they don't live close to each other. So for example, something like a council that determines the curriculum for Afrikaans schools, something like that. So it's sort of, and it's something that if you're Afrikaans, you can be part of that process. So it's more decentralized, not in terms of territory, but in terms of cultural recognition.
There's sort of special cultural zones. So we've got special economic zones where sort of taxes and nonsense doesn't apply because we want to get that economy going in that area. So maybe in this instance, what you're describing is maybe in like the Zulu kingdom, having the ability to interact directly with diplomacy, foreign diplomacy, for the sake of the Zulu kingdom only, not for the sake of the entire country.
Yeah, that's fair. But if it's cultural autonomy as opposed to territorial autonomy, it's not so much the Zulu kingdom as a place, it's the Zulu people as a people, even though they don't live in KwaZulu-Natal.
Right.
So it's not so much linked to a territory, it's linked to a cultural community.
Right.
And there are, like in Estonia, there are places where
I was going to say, does this exist? Because I can't think of an example. Like where has this been?
Yeah, there has been, Estonia is one example. There has been some others, but so a practical example. Let's take schools. Let's take the Afrikaners as an example. A practical way to apply something like that would be, doesn't matter where you live. If you're part of this community, there's some form of a process. It could be an election or it could be something else where a council is decided on. And this council is like a mini cultural parliament, you could say.
Right.
And this council has a very limited but a very clearly defined authority, which is over the affairs of that cultural community. Like cultural institutions, monuments, museums, cultural practices, and schools, for example. But that then counts for different cultural communities. So that's one way things could play out.
I think we have a house of traditional leaders.
Yes.
That
in theory
seems rather toothless from what I can understand. But I think that the idea is there. Like,
they are very concerned that they don't get the recognition that they should be getting from the government. Yes.
Well, and rightly so. I don't think they get recognized at all for the most part.
So they're regarded by the government as a threat because people value their traditional authority, which means they don't value the government as the authority. But I mean, that's just one example. Another example is more territorial autonomy, like the Zulu Kingdom as a place, if we use that example, or the Western Cape as a place.
So balkanization.
Yes, it's not necessarily secession. It could be that. An example, the best example of that is South Tyrol, which is a province in Italy with autonomy. So that's one way things could go, is different, not necessarily the provinces as we know them, but communities, different territories in South Africa that have more autonomy, that have a large say over how their tax money is used. Only a certain percentage goes to the central government. The rest is used by them in the way they decide it has to be used in their community. And they have a degree of lawmaking ability. So in South Tyrol, or Alto Adige as it is also called, even though it's a province in Italy, they have their own parliament, which is like the provincial council, you could say, but they make their own laws. And there's a certain limit in terms of the broad legal framework they cannot cross, but within that territory, they are in a sense governed almost as if they are a country, because it's a mostly Germanic-speaking province in Italy, and they call themselves the Tyroleans. And so we can have something like that in South Africa. South Africa can also have secession, which is the country literally splitting up into different.
Sure. I mean, but the thing with South Tyrol is like these people are Europeans. We live in Africa. I mean, it's a completely different context. I mean,
yes, it is.
I think if you speak to a lot of people in a room in a civilized debate, I think they would generally sort of agree with you in the way, like, it's good to have more cultural autonomy or maybe territorial autonomy, but at a macro level, this is like forbidden, right? This is like completely outside of the scope.
So the other lessons or case studies in the world are only have limited applicability because they have, as you say, unique circumstances. But what I can say about the Tyroleans is they had a very dictatorial government. I mean, they were under Mussolini, and there was this interesting story of an actual deal between Hitler and Mussolini about the Tyroleans. And the deal was that the Tyroleans, who are German-speaking people in South Tyrol as we know today, had to be given a choice. They can stay where they are, but they have to become Italians, or they can move to Austria and they can remain Germans. So so they've had their own struggles, and there was also violence. But they eventually got to a point where they wanted secession. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, and they eventually got to the point where they got an autonomous province. It's a different dynamic here. There was a lot of friction, and a lot of the friction has been resolved. And you don't necessarily resolve friction through appeasement. They didn't get what they have through appeasement. They got it by taking a very firm stance. But that is not to say that what they did would work here, or that what they have would work here. But it's worth looking into.
It's an example of how maybe it could come around. But as we sit here, it's 2025, South Africa, probably funny enough, one of the weakest governments we can think of, but also one of the more pernicious ones. Quite chaotic. Do you find that this chaos allows you within the Pioneer Initiative to actually, is it more likely this will happen through chaos or through negotiation? Let's just say that.
Yeah. So let me firstly say, I made the comment recently that the ANC, you could say the South African government, but especially the ANC, is like an injured buffalo.
Yeah.
Which is, it's at its weakest, which is why it's at its most dangerous. And so if you go hunting, you don't want to mess with an injured buffalo. But it's dangerous because it's weak. And so I think that's more or less where we are now. So I can try to answer your question with a Game of Thrones reference. So I'm one of the people who very intently followed Game of Thrones and was also very disappointed by the ending. But one of my favorite characters is Littlefinger. Not because I associate with him, but because I thought he was such an interesting character from a sort of storytelling perspective. And there's this famous scene, like in the first or second season, where Littlefinger and Varys sit in the throne room and they talk about their schemes. It's the two big schemers. And then Varys says that they talk about the lie that is holding the realm together.
Yeah.
And then Varys says, but it's a noble lie. And we need to maintain this so that we can keep the realm, the unity of the realm. And what happens when we lose it? We're going to result into chaos, which is a gaping pit where we won't be able to get out from. And then Littlefinger laughs and he says, chaos isn't a pit, chaos is a ladder. And so he makes this speech about when you're in chaos, you have the opportunity to do certain things. And so I do think that the chaos, if we can use that term, in South Africa is in many ways bad. But it also provides some opportunities. And it provides opportunities for us to organize as communities. And I'm not saying that it's opportunities for destructive behavior, because that's not an opportunity. That's more a risk. But it does. We do have some opportunities now as a result of the turmoil that we didn't have earlier. And what I mean by that is, I mean, we should organize as communities. We should be well organized. There's a new threat now, for example, of taking away gun rights or eroding our right to protect ourselves. But the question is, can the government enforce that? And if the government says you're not allowed to own firearms, are people going to hand over their guns, or are they just going to have illegal guns?
Yeah.
And so there are some opportunities for us to become better organized as communities, to reach out to other countries, to other places in the world to get support. They can't fix our problems, but they can at least be involved, or they can support in some way. And I think it all goes down, it goes back to being well organized within the context of our communities. And the fact that there's chaos in the country is not necessarily a bad thing.
I would argue it creates far more opportunity here than in many parts of the world. I often say South Africa is in some ways 30 years ahead of the rest of the world, the so-called Western world, in terms of the chaos. Because we can see the chaos in Europe with high migration, the sort of double-tier justice systems, and people being arrested for praying. I mean, this is the sort of liberal tyranny 101. We've sort of had that for like close to 20 years. We sort of understand how it works now. And at the end of the day, a lot of this tyranny is sort of a paper tiger, right?
Yes.
It really is. You just say no, and yeah, it's no. Like people, especially in South Africa, the balance of forces argument, along with what the ANC says, you just say no. Like, they're not going to send hitmen like to murder you or whatever. I mean, in a real Western country, you would probably be Tommy Robinson, maybe, in prison for some nonsense crime that doesn't really exist. But here, you're able to freely talk about the end of the nation, the end of the nation state. And we're only public. I mean, they've got 20 bodyguards off camera. No one can see that. But there's very few countries, I would say, where this conversation can take place about the future of our country maybe not being a country. That's something.
Yeah, so in England, if they want to arrest you for praying, they can do it.
Oh, absolutely.
In South Africa, if they make a law and say it's illegal to pray in public, people will just keep doing it. It's not.
Yeah.
And we've seen examples of civil disobedience working in South Africa. We saw it with the e-tolls. We saw it with the COVID lockdown. And I think we're going to see more of it in the future. And that's the thing. And that's why, and this is something Rob Hershoff especially has been talking about, and many others as well, but why it's so important for the business community to come to the table. Because a lot of these paper tiger ideas are only enforced because the private sector is allowing it to be enforced. If we get to a point in South Africa where the private sector says we're not going to comply, we're going to stop complying, all of these destructive policy ideas are going to come crashing down.
Yeah, believe me, I worked in government.
Well,
that's another I worked really hard for a number of months, and you can see it immediately. There's not much there in terms of resistance.
And the government approach to solving problems is to write documents.
Correct.
And documents are not reality.
Oh, correct. I mean, these whole departments, especially the department I worked in, was just like, the process matters far more than anything else. Like, what are you trying to achieve? I don't know, but the process to do something is this. I'm like, okay, but who cares? Like, what about saving agriculture? Oh, no, but yes, we need to focus on the process. So, bureaucrats they got a lot of power that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it only exists because we think it exists. Yeah. Like the public thinks it exists.
Yeah.
So as soon as you think to yourself, it's just writing on a piece of paper, like, the Constitution. Like, it doesn't make it reality. Yeah. It's just writing on a piece of paper. Well, this could be your Constitution right here.
So I think that's why, this is slightly philosophical, but there's a practical point, why Edmund Burke is so relevant to us, the father of conservatism. Because Edmund Burke said a lot of things, but if we can reduce it to one statement, it would be that value experience over theory. And that was sort of the main argument of his criticism of the French Revolution. He said these guys are a bunch of ideologues. Yeah. They have all these theoretical ideas on how to make the world a better place, but none of these ideas work in practice. So if you want to change the world, to use that term, look at what actually works and look at what reality is like. Then go to documents. And so documents are important, but they would always be subservient to real life experience and to reality. You cannot conform reality to comply with a theory, but your theories should comply with reality. And South Africa is a wonderful example of that. We have all these incredible theories. The Constitution is very theoretical.
Oh, very.
And these government programs are very theoretical, but the question is, what is reality? And the gap between the de jure and the de facto is just going like this. And I think South Africa is a very good example that in the debate between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, Burke was right.
Correct.
Thomas Paine had this line about the great thing about democracy with reference to the French Revolution was that he said, and it's very funny from a South African perspective, reading it today, he said that sometimes in a democracy, that you will find that the minority is correct and the majority is wrong. But the great thing about democracy is it's a process where people interact with each other. And if that's the case, eventually the majority would take up the correct position and the majority would be right. Now, that sounds great from a theoretical perspective, but in a country like South Africa, where you have different civilizations, different cultures, different ideologies, it just doesn't work that way. And Burke's response was, that's great, but look at reality.
Yes, over time it'll come right.
Yeah.
That's a lot of faith in something that may or may not happen. So one last question for you. There's been a lot of surveys. Institute of Racial Relations is quite well known for their surveys about general attitudes of South Africans in South Africa. And the conclusion for the Institute and others is that a lot of South Africans agree on the same thing. And it's borne out by only recently 77% of respondents to a survey said South Africa's heading in the wrong direction.
Yep.
Do you think that is? Do you think if this idea of South Africa not being real, do you think it can be real because people agree on most things? So if we have a Nayib Bukele who comes in tomorrow and in a year solves crime and makes us economically great 10% in a year, is that possible through this idea that we actually agree on most things? Yeah. So we just need like a figurehead where all the energy can be channeled into.
I've been thinking about this exact thing for quite some time, and I have an answer to that, because what bothers me about this is that there are two contradicting narratives that both seem true. Right. The one narrative is from a racial perspective or a social cohesion perspective, South Africa is in big trouble. Not just because of what we see on social media and not just because of EFF chanting and so forth, we see that as well, but people who voted for the ANC, MK and the ESF combined are 65%.
Yeah, correct.
65% of people voted for really aggressive leftist parties. Now I know there's this debate about is MK left wing or right wing, but it's still essentially socialist.
Well, it's black nationalists, right?
Yeah, so 65% of people voted for those to be parties. And then the other narrative is that actually we're all very much the same, or this we should unite the middle ground. I think that's part of the RR's line is most people in South Africa are social conservatives and we have more in common than we think.
Yeah.
And so the question is, if most people in South Africa are social conservatives, why do most people vote for the ANC and the EFF and MK? And I think there's some truth in both of those points, but I think it's true. Most people are social conservative and Christian and religious, which is why, if not Christian, religious, like we spoke about the Muslims community, which is why many of this gender stuff that America has wouldn't work here.
Yeah.
But I think there's another aspect of this discussion, which I actually thought of when in preparing for my discussion with Ben Shapiro, reading his book, 3 Easy Steps to Destroy America. He makes the argument that America is a collective whole because of 3 things. The one is Americans, people living in America, have broadly speaking a shared philosophy. It's sort of the philosophy of the founding fathers.
Sure.
And broadly speaking, they have a shared culture, and broadly speaking, they have a shared perspective on history. And if you want to destroy America, that's Shapiro's argument, you need to destroy these things. Destroy the American philosophy, American culture, and American conception of history.
Which has been happening for 15 years, one could argue.
Yes, yeah. And so the question then is, does South Africa have that? Does South Africa have a shared philosophy? I don't think we do. Does South Africa have one big shared culture? I don't think we do.
Definitely not. I mean, it would be silly to say
we only have braai and rugby, basically. Yeah. Does South Africa have a shared perspective of history? We definitely don't have that. And so that doesn't mean that we're enemies or we should be enemies. But South Africa is not a collective whole in the same way that America used to be a collective whole, at least. And so we shouldn't expect of South Africa to achieve the same results as a collective whole that America has achieved, because South Africa is a territory inhabited by a variety of nations. That doesn't mean that we have to be at war with each other. We can cooperate.
Yeah.
But in as far as we don't recognize this reality, it's again, it goes back to this thing of valuing theory over reality. Yeah. And we must get back to reality. And then we can have good theory that conforms reality, as opposed to trying to get reality to conform with our theories.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think that's the sort of the idea with our children as well, like just teach them reality. Like the theory is fine. Maybe you can become an astronaut or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
Probably not. Yeah. Don't lower your expectations of it.
Well, you can excel in whatever you decide to do and what fits your talents and your skill set and your personality.
Yeah.
Some things just don't fit your skill set and your personality. And children should discover that. But if you teach children you can be whatever you want to be, you discourage them from discovering their own uniqueness.
And I think if our children know what reality is, they are far more likely to stay here and live.
Including reality not only in South Africa, but reality
in the world as well. In the world as well. So you just got back from America. You spoke to Tucker Carlson, you spoke to Ben Shapiro. We watched these guys from here, and it always seems like they're far away, great ideas, but like there's very little connection with them as people. Now that you've met them,
yes,
What was it like? What was the experience like for both of them?
Well, let me, well, and Peterson, of course, we can talk about him as well. But let me say something about each of them. And my personal experience. So I've known Tucker for some time. We met in 2018. And what I really like about Tucker is, and I've said this a few times, but he's a really curious person by nature.
Yeah.
I think that's why he's a good journalist. If what he does could be defined as journalism or a commentator, because even off camera, he always asks questions. He has strong opinions, but he asks questions because he really wants to know the answer. And sometimes he's somewhat conspiratorial. It's like he would put something to you and say, why is this happening? What's your view on this? But you can just see from his facial expression, the famous Tucker face, that is really so zoned into what you are saying. He's a very, very good listener. And I think what is his strength, or one of his strengths, is that Tucker is really an ardent reader. And he doesn't come across as a bookworm. He comes across as a very almost goofy social guy.
Yeah.
There's a video on X I saw. It's an old video where he was fishing in Central Park. He was just standing there fishing. And then some guy walks up to him with a camera, and Tucker asks, "Are you filming this?" And the guy says, "Yes, I'm just filming everything." And then they start having the conversation. But the conversation is Tucker asking this guy a bunch of questions. And so he's a very good conversationalist, and he's very curious by nature, and he's very well read. And I think that's why people underestimate him. And I think that's why he's so successful. What was interesting about Shapiro is, in a certain sense, my preconceived idea was met, and then not as well, or then broken, because he creates the impression as someone who's always in a hurry,
Yes.
who always has something to say, and who's always very busy. And so when I got to the studio, he was busy. It was funny when you walk in the door and you hear Shapiro's voice. He's busy recording his podcast and speaking on double speed. And okay, well, this is not a video, it's him actually sitting there. And he was busy recording, and he took a break, and he only came to me and he said hi, and he walked away. And so it's very sort of came across as being in a hurry. And we didn't speak much before the interview. After the interview, then I think that was the last thing he did that day. It's almost as if he changed, like from his work mode to his social mode. And he just kept sitting in his chair. I was sort of taking off the mic, and then he said to me, "Listen, but let's have a conversation. Let's discuss this further." And he also asked, how can he help, and so forth. And then we had a great conversation, maybe for, 30, 40 minutes, about what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in America. And he was also very interested. And instead of telling me how things are, he was asking me. So that I thought was very, very good. And I'm very grateful for the interview. And he also gave us some advice. He said, "Listen, this approach is a good approach. Be careful of this approach, and you should get to those people." And that was very good. Peterson was interesting in the sense that he was very well prepared for our interview, for our discussion.
Yeah, this is Jordan Peterson.
Peterson, yes. So he came in. I was there before him, preparing for the interview, and he was there like 5 minutes before, or maybe 10. And he came with notes on his phone, and he showed me some articles that were published in South Africa, in the South African media, like Daily Maverick and so forth. And he asked me, "Have you read this one? And have you read this one? And have you read this one? Because I want to ask you about these." And I have to say, the most difficult of these three was the Peterson interview for me, because the Peterson interview was more, I don't want to say more philosophical, but his questions are more difficult to predict in a certain sense. And at one point he spoke about how it's typical, you could expect this actually from Peterson. I mentioned something about the Great Trek, and he was like, "Well, this reminds me of Nietzsche." And he starts talking about Nietzsche. And it's like, okay, should we talk about Nietzsche now or not? But he was, all three of them, if I can mention these three, even though among them there are some differences, but all three of them were very supportive. And that's really, I think, is a breakthrough. Not for me, but I think a breakthrough for us and for South Africa, is the extent to which our concerns really now are on the world, you could say the world agenda, or is increasingly on the world agenda. And each of these people said to me separately that they want to help to get more people to talk about what's happening in South Africa and to get more people to contribute to a solution.
So and that's the upside to meeting all of these people, people that I've been listening and watching for a very long time. That the upside is you get this uptick in influence, uptick in people knowing who you are and what you're talking about. The downside is you have to come back to South Africa with our media class, which is less well informed than even Tucker, Ben and Jordan. So after all those interviews happened, there was a lot of pushback here. Mostly for sort of the people that used to work for Afriforum Solidarity, but you're always lumped in with them for some reason. About the misinformation and you know these terms that they use. Instead of just saying he lied, because they need to prove a lie, which they can't. So they use these other terms called disinformation and misinformation. What has been the impact on you on your return back to our country as Ernst Roets? Has it been a negative downside to the upside that you received in America?
Well, the upside and the downside is more intense, especially on social media. I mean, I've really had some very grotesque death threats on social media, at least. If someone tweets to you, I'm going to come and murder you. It's different than someone calling you. So I've had quite a bunch of that. People saying they're going to necklace me when I come back and they're going to wait for me at the airport. And that is concerning, but it's not too, fortunately in that sense, I'm quite stoic. So it doesn't bother me that much. The support is also much bigger that I can really say. But I think the point is we must just build on what we have achieved so far. And this misinformation thing is, at first it was very annoying to me when you say something and then people accuse you of spreading misinformation, but they don't say what the misinformation is. It's just misinformation. It's like racist, but they don't prove, don't point to anything tangible. And because this misinformation thing is sort of a new thing. It was always you're a racist, and then it became you're a Nazi, and then it became treason, and now it's misinformation.
But it's a PR term.
Yes.
To send
like white monopoly capital.
That's it. It's a PR term. Instead of just saying, no, Adam, you lied about a Zania philosophy at the University of Pretoria, you say, I know you were misinformed about it. Like you didn't really understand what you were talking about.
So there was one report, I think it was on News 24, sort of exposing all the lies I told on the Tucker Carlson interview.
Oh, right.
But there wasn't any lies that was pointed out in the article. The article was just, the article basically said, okay, so he was telling the truth about these things, but his conclusion is wrong.
Oh, right.
Or he was employing truths to convey a lie. It's like, and someone once accused me of speaking in technical truths. So it's not what you're saying is a lie because of this and this. It's, we can't really find a mistake in what you're saying, but we don't agree with it. So therefore it's misinformation.
So when they came after me, Danny Maverick said, he's been accused of being pro-Putin, pro-Trump, and mocking Zelensky. Where's the crime? Whatever. Yeah. So what? Yeah. I can accuse you of being anything. So
it's like Wikipedia is like that as well.
Like, that's not the crime.
This organization is labeled as whatever, white supremacist or.
But at the end of the day, I assume the upside is much more worthwhile to you.
Definitely. And I should say the upside is bigger than I expected it to be, and the downside is smaller than I expected it to be. So there's a downside, but the upside is better, and I think we must build on that, and we must say, how can we then move forward? How can we get more people to speak about this? How can we get to different audiences, and how can we? But speaking abroad, I should just emphasize that is only one small part of what we're doing, because most of the work is where we are.
Adams, what a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those who are keen, the links to the Pioneer Initiative is below. I have subscribed to it. I do give a bit of money to it. I do like the idea.
Appreciate it.
And Adams, I wish you all the best with it. And thank you so much for coming on Tucker Carlson or Ben Shapiro, but now you came to like the main podcast. So I'm leveling up. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And for those who enjoyed it, subscribe. Thank you. Bye.